Hey guys, this is John, and welcome to a standard video. It's been a while. Haven't played one of these in quite some time. Let's meet d4 with knight f6. I'm playing a player rated 2061. This is a 10+2 game, so 10 minutes with a 2-second increment. What shall I play against d4 mainline? I have a lot of experience in the Benko Gambit. Yeah, why not? Let's go for that. Let's play c5. See if my opponent reacts with d5. No, they take, actually. Okay, so taking I don't think is all that critical. I'm looking to recover the pawn, of course. Looks like I'll get a chance to do that. I don't think white is worse here, but I also don't think this is much of a try for an advantage, primarily because white's trading a center pawn for a wing pawn when they play d takes c5. So, yeah, e3, blocking the bishop, making sure there's no bishop takes f2 stuff. That looks pretty sensible. Let's just castle. I'm going to try to play the opening relatively quickly because those longtime viewers out there, you know that playing too slowly in the opening is an issue for me. Especially when I'm doing commentary on these slightly longer games. I have a tendency to over-explain. So we'll try to avoid that. Okay, knight c3. So the way I feel about this position, I can pretty much play d5 at any point and look for some trades. I think that's fine. It doesn't look particularly inspiring, though. Yeah, I could play knight c6, knight a6. I think I'm going to go knight c6. I think some purists would probably play d5 right away here. I might end up doing that, especially if white plays something like b3, bishop b2. Maybe I can get in d5, d4, open the center in some favorable way. But I don't think I have to rush this move. So just a developing move, and let's wait and see what happens. I gotta say, it feels pretty good to record one of these games because I didn't even check prior to making this video, prior to clicking record, when the last time I posted one of these videos was. Oh, please don't disconnect. That would be so lame. After I'm all fired up to go here, we'll give him a little chance to reconnect. I can't claim victory for another 60 seconds anyways. But anyways, yes, I have been looking forward to playing some of these longer games. You guys have been requesting them for a while. But yeah, just various life circumstances, being busy has always sort of stood in the way from being able to comfortably click record and go for it, or at least mentally it has. But I'm excited to do this one. And hopefully more. Definitely more. Ooh, this is not looking good. Usually if someone... Oh, they're back. Okay, A3. A3 looking for B4. I don't know if I've ever been more happy that my opponent is continuing a game. Yeah, so I think this move is sensible. I could try to prevent B4 entirely with A5. But I could also go ahead with the D5 move or something like Rook C8. Maybe Rook C8, say B4, Bishop E7, Bishop B2, and then D5. Yeah, let's play that. Because I think the Rook is almost always going to be useful on this half-open C file. So I might as well prioritize that. Yeah, drop the Bishop back. I wouldn't expect much other than Bishop B2. Yeah, just a sensible move. I could see this being an IQP scenario where after takes, white goes knight b5, tries to maneuver for the d4 square. Maybe I want to probe with a5 now, or at least I could think about it. Invite b5. I think very likely white would play b5. I could go for some sort of hedgehog type setup too, d6. Usually if you're going to go for a hedgehog setup, it's better if the knight's on d7 though. On c6, you could run into some issues with knight d5 stuff if you put your queen on c7. I can play something semi-waiting like a6. So a lot of different candidate moves here. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on them because I want to make a decision relatively quickly. Even queen c7, quite honestly, looks like a pretty good candidate move. d5 move, a5, b5, knight a7. How do I feel about attacking that construction? Okay, I have an idea. I'm going to play a5. And on b5, the expected reply, I'm actually going to play knight b8. I'm going to undevelop the knight. And I want to see if I can maybe opt for that hedgehog with the knight coming to d7, as it naturally tends to be well placed on, and basically try to prove that the c4 pawn is a weakness long term. Okay, so I'm trying to induce white to overextend a bit with their queen side and leave this c pawn vulnerable to a long term attack. And white plays queen b3. Curious, because I have 4 attackers on that square, or sorry, 3 attackers, and only 1 defender by white. So I think that's just a pawn. Now, which way will I take when white takes back? Probably with the bishop. That looks like the way to go. Yeah, if I take with the knight, maybe it allows rook a7 or something. So let's take with the bishop. Okay, white jumping in, acting like nothing has happened. Hey, I mean, pawn's not coming back, so they might as well just play something sensible. That opens up this bishop. I wonder if knight e4 makes sense now, trying to maybe pivot the knight to c5. This knight's defending on the b4 bishop, so no issues there. Maybe knight a7 is a move I should have considered, but I don't think I'm that concerned about it. I might even be able to play knight c5 in response. Yeah, white plays rook d1. So now I could come back here, could play queen e7. Looks pretty good. I think I like the look of that, actually. Get off the file of the rook. Yeah, overprotect the bishop as well. So it relieves my knight of any defensive burden if knight a7 or something. Okay, doing okay on the clock. About 7 minutes left. And up a pawn. Yeah, knight d4. First instinct is to trade here. Now, knight d2 would be a nice response to knight d4 on the previous move with the rook here. I might still consider this, but I think trading, at least initially, makes more sense. Probably not knight c5, because knight takes c6 could be a thing. Probably not the end of the world. Also, with knight d4, I should be aware that this bishop can come to f3. I think pretty good chance that white's going to do that. Knight a5 is a move here. Attack the queen, hit the pawn on c4. Ooh, yeah, maybe I should do that. Knight a5, and if queen c2, maybe I play d5 then. Yeah, attack down the c file. My knight is propped up nicely. I like that. Bit of a strange response to knight d4, because you would think I should trade that centralized knight, but this knight sticking around here and preventing the other knight from coming to d4 and also blocking the bishop may actually work in my favor. So, as strange as this looks, it might, in fact, be a good move. So let's see where that queen goes. All right, pulls back to c2 as expected. So I'm thinking d5 in this position and pile up on that pawn. Maybe I could play knight takes c4 first and then d5. That also looks like it works, but I think I'd have to calculate this more. Whereas d5, I feel I can play pretty quickly without much calculation, and I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that. Maybe knight a7 is a thing to attack my rook, hoping for some sort of repetition, or even the other knight coming to b5, but I think I can figure this out when I get there. I'm thinking knight a7, maybe rook c5 is an acceptable reply. Stay out of range of the knights. And I think this bishop being severed from the connection to my queen is okay, so long as I'm cashing in here soon. Maybe there's queen a4 at that point, bishop b2. Instinctively, I feel that's going to work out well for me. And in the 10+2 game, you largely have to go with your instincts. Okay, f3. Bit of a weakening move. I'm happy to see this one, I think. Probably going to want to pull back here. Just debating if knight d6 makes sense, offer a trade or something. Probably unnecessary. Probably unnecessary, although not the worst idea. Yeah, let's just play back to f6. Trying to cut down on the extraneous stuff that I have to calculate, which is a good tip in a position that you are already ahead material in, or you know you're better. Try to make your life as simple as possible. I think I've been preaching that on my channel for, over 10 years now. Keep it simple. Yeah, unfortunately for my opponent, I don't see a ton of ways that they can complicate this. They do go for the knight a7 move. And again, rook a8, or maybe this move rook c5. Maybe rook c5 makes a little less sense now, though, because queen a4 could be problematic, right? Because with my knight on e4, I had bishop c3 in reply to that, but now I don't. So maybe I just play rook a8 and go from there. See how white wants to handle that. This feels almost like a free move because they will have to address the attack on the knight somehow. They can't insert this move. So yeah, they play the knight back. And now maybe I play the other rook over to double down on the attack on the pawn again, but leave this rook controlling the a7 square. That looks nice. That looks really harmonious. I'm keeping the tension on the pawn, lining up with the queen. Yeah, it looks good. I was briefly considering on the previous move if white could have played knight from d4 to b5. But that, in general, looked very awkward. Probably didn't work out, but it did open the bishop, opens the d file a little bit. Perhaps would have created some complications. Okay, knight b3. So I think the default move here is knight takes c4, pick up the pawn. Pawn takes c4 also looks good, but I like the idea of taking with the knight if I can. And then if rook takes a8, take with the bishop, leave the rook and the pawn guarding. Yeah, let's do that. Okay, take with the pawn or the rook. Could even throw in this move first if I want, which might not be bad because I don't think I actually care about the c-file much. I'd rather take with the pawn at some point and then bulldoze through here. So yeah, I think I'm going to throw this move in. I don't think white taking with any of these pieces is going to impact the evaluation. Takes with the knight. Yeah, so I could take with the rook for tempo, but this looks nice. Open the bishop, get the two connected pawns. I don't think there's any issue with white having the d file. I have the d6 square controlled. So yeah, d takes c4. Maybe knight d5 starts to come into consideration. Looking for knight takes e3. If white tries to stop that with e4, well, then they're opening themselves up for queen c5 check. Okay, yeah, and that's probably going to happen. Queen c5. It looked like a tempting move because it blocks my bishop as well. But anytime you push an f pawn, you're castled on that same wing. You're weakening your king position. So I think queen c5 is going to do it here because if knight d4, I have e5. Doubling down on that pressure. Okay, white blocks the bishop. Take the knight. And that's a piece and two pawns. No real complications here. White could take on f6, slightly weakens my king, but it's not nearly enough. Yeah, and queen f2, probably trying to get something going on a good day towards my king. I have a real buzzkill move here, though, with bishop c5, which I will play. Guaranteeing at least one more trade. Really taking the wind out of white's sails. So knight c2, white tries to get the knight in the game. Kind of like the look of e5 here, trying to get white to trade. Could just take. Taking also looks pretty attractive. I think I might do that. Even though it gives white's knight an excuse to come to the center, I put them right back in a pin, or at least in a a favorable alignment with queen c5. So let's say knight takes d4, queen c5, looking to follow up with e5 soon. Further trades coming. Just chop, 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 trade pieces, and win the game. Again, don't make it any more complicated than you have to in a winning position. Also, in a situation like this, I'm not in a rush to move these pawns. I know these pawns are going to come down the board at some point, but if I can get multiple trades in this piece up position in the meantime, I'm very happy to do that. I'm not in a rush to push. Yeah, queen e1, I guess trying to avoid stuff here, but e5, winning more material, and resigns. All right, thanks to my opponent for the game. So, not the most competitive game. I do try to keep in mind that the competitiveness is what makes these games interesting, but I don't have control over what my opponents are going to play. I'm still going to post this, of course, because there were some instructive moments. But just be advised, in this series, sometimes there are lopsided games like this. And I think this was largely characterized by White's decision to defend b4 with queen b3, which just doesn't work because I have 1, 2, 3 attackers, and White was only adding one additional defender to the pawn. So they were outnumbered on that square. I think they got to play b5. Maybe the engine will also say b takes a5 is playable, although I think I would have been happy to play this. B takes a5, knight takes a5, and attack the pawn on c4. So those of you who play the Benoni or the Benko Gambit, this might be a decent model game for you about how to handle this d takes c5 line, right? Taking the pawn on c5, because I do think e6 is a bit more interesting and enterprising compared to queen a5 check, which would be the way to play if you want to instantly get the pawn back. You don't have to rush doing so. So we'll take a look at that in the analysis briefly. Yeah, otherwise, there's a few ways White could have played this. A3, b4 looked reasonable, but I think also b3 and bishop b2 directly deserve some attention. I don't think White has much here. This is probably equal at best for White because the dark square bishop is blocked. And again, Black has 2 center pawns to White's 1. So kind of like a Sicilian, where in an open Sicilian where White is trading their d pawn for the black c pawn, unless White drums up something early and gains an initiative in the first half of the game, oftentimes Black is doing quite well because of that dynamic of the 2 center pawns versus the 1. That really does matter a lot of times. Yeah, I'll be a little bit curious about in the middle game if White ever had compensation around here. Knight e4. This move feels a little loose because my knight is undefended, but I don't see how White can take advantage of that. I really like the fact that it helped control d6 better, and I also had knight c5 in mind. Yeah, maybe somewhere around here too, I'll be looking to see what the engine has to say about d5 or knight takes c4 and then d5. I felt like I played this pretty logically, but there's always scope for improvement. Okay, let's have a quick look. So just the raw stats. I got a 97% accuracy, 0 inaccuracies, 0 mistakes, 0 blunders. Again, probably some room for improvement here. We're going to look at it, but I'm not totally surprised by this because I didn't have to make too many tough decisions in this game. This was largely determined by this queen b3 move early on. And by the way, those who haven't watched my videos very much, or especially haven't watched the standard series, I do always encourage you guys to try to draw some conclusions on your own prior to looking at the engine analysis. Okay? It doesn't have to be some, multi-hour investigation of even a tournament game, like some long time control game. Like, you don't have to invest as much time as you spent playing the game or something to really do yourself a service there. But you should have some conclusions that as a human, you're drawing out before looking at the engine. Okay? Because as soon as you look at the engine eval, you're biased instantly. And that's where the active learning, becomes less consequential. You want to spur that active learning on by just constantly asking yourself, all right, in hindsight, how could I or my opponent have improved? And then consult the engine to get the true answer. So yeah, I played c5 in response to c4 here. Over the board, white almost always plays d5 in this position, keeping this center pawn and grabbing more space. There's a bunch of theory here. If black wants to go for a Benoni, they can play e6. You can try to duck into a King's Indian or Benoni type position if you want to start with g6 here. I was probably going to play the Benko Gambit, which is a staple of my repertoire against d4. That's where black plays b5, and after c takes b5, they play a6. Gambiting a pawn, let's say takes, you can take right away or play g6 first and try to get this back. Out of an opening like this, I should probably play this the correct way. In the long run, white is hoping to, or black rather, is hoping to demonstrate that they have compensation for the pawn on the queen side. So let's just say something illustrative like this, where black is looking to use these open A and B files towards the white queen side as hopefully compensation, something to show for that missing pawn. Black also has a very compact structure, very few weaknesses. White has to neutralize the activity of the black pieces. The engines tend to say this whole Benko Gambit is a little bit dubious these days. I think this is one line that has been hit harder than others in the souped up stockfish era. I think this was more playable 10 years ago and definitely more playable 20 years ago. Nowadays, very rarely see this at the top level in serious games because there have been paths shown to a pretty nice advantage for white. Although black is finding interesting ways to play this, especially with this g6 move, which in some cases entails a quick queen a5 or taking with the knight on a6 even. I don't even fully understand all the nuances of this line. It's engine type stuff. So if you're interested, I do think the Benko Gambit is a pretty good practical weapon still, but I wouldn't recommend it. Kind of like the Scandinavian. I think if you're a super GM watching this video, you're probably going to have a bone to pick with this opening, even though it's playable for 99.9% of other players. So if you're like, I don't know, Shakhriyar Mamedyarov, just pulling a name at random, or Anish Giri watching this video, you're probably going to say this is unsound, but that really only exists in theory versus actual practice for a small subset of players. So at any rate, white plays d takes c5. And yeah, I like this e6 move, threatening the pawn. Now, I don't think I mentioned it in the video, but if white had defended the pawn on c5 with b4, I was going to play this move a5, which is a bog standard means of undermining an extended pawn chain from the opponent. What do you do when you're trying to chop down a tree? You chop down at the base of the tree, right? You start at the base. So we're looking for that support. We're trying to knock out that support. And it's crucial here that white cannot play a3, because if they do, we can just take. And white can't take back because they lose the rook on a1. There are circumstances where white might be able to play a3, but that's usually only if the rook on a1 is defended, like white has already played bishop b2 or something. So you can see how shaky this is, white taking the pawn on c5, if they try to support that pawn with b4. They really have to be ready to extend that pawn chain. Defending b4 with a piece, let's say, is really not great structurally, right? Because take, I can play a6. I'm going to win the pawn back. White's queen side is in shambles. They're going to have isolated pawns. They're losing time with their queen. Same thing with a move like bishop d2, right? Take. Yeah, for the moment they're defending, but I mean, in this case, I could even take here if I wanted. And queen a5 check, win the pawn back. And I think all of this is a little more ambitious, once again, than playing the direct queen a5. I don't think this is terrible, but it maybe shows a lack of confidence in my ability to win the pawn back with a piece versus insisting on doing it with the queen, right? Because it gives white some extra options. Maybe white tries to duck into a Sicilian or Maroczy bind type position. My queen could get kind of buffeted around unnecessarily here. So e6, I think white did the right thing. They didn't try to defend the pawn. They just developed. A typical mistake here, which I guarantee if we put the Lee chess database on this position, it's going to indicate, is white playing bishop g5. You want to pause your video here and figure out why this move would be a mistake. Go for it. So black to move and win material. Okay, there's probably multiple ways to do this, like queen b6 might be good, attacking f2 and b2. But the most direct move here is bishop takes f2, check, drawing the enemy king out, and then knight e4 check. And we're going to scoot back and pick up the bishop. Black has won a pawn, also destroyed white's king safety, and white can't castle anymore. There's other iterations of this too, like you can get fancy with knight e4 as well, saying, oh no, my queen, try to pull off a checkmate. Sometimes the engine likes this option better in this type of tactic, which can occur with both colors. It does give white the option of bishop e3, but even stuff like this and then queen b6 is very, very good for black. Even if there was no queen b6, clearly these pawns double isolated on the e-file are a big liability for white going forward. So typical blunder there. I won't even bother loading up the Lee chess database, but you could probably find tens of thousands of examples of white blundering here. I'd be curious if someone wants to look it up. So white blocks my bishop with e3. Makes a lot of sense, but they do block their own bishop. You can see the eval's already right around 0. It's just equal. Not even right around 0, just zeros everywhere. Black has already equalized. Yeah, b6. I like doing this. In this case, I'm playing a lower rated player. I could play the d5 move. I'm sure that's in the top 5 suggestions as well. But I didn't see a rush to play d5. You know, my general MO, my modus operandi when playing down and rating is try to keep the position as open-ended as reasonably possible. Okay? I don't always play that way. It depends on who I'm playing, but that is my framework. Reason being, as the higher rated player, I think and know that I'm much more capable of navigating a position with many possibilities compared to my lower rated opponent. So if I force matters and I play lines, you know, like d5, this is a very basic example, but if I play d5 too early, in my opinion, that gives white a very easy decision. They're almost certainly going to take the pawn. I mean, maybe they try to get fancy and delay it, but taking the pawn is a move that both my opponent and I know is completely acceptable. And it's hard to beat players if you string those sort of acceptable decisions together because you're not giving them margin for error. You're not giving them enough of a chance to go wrong. And I've harped on this concept many times in my videos, but it's worth thinking about, and I think it's under-discussed in chess, is the concept of letting your opponents go wrong. You could actually say this is one of the core philosophies I've preached on this channel over the years. Literally, the first video in my Chess Fundamentals series is on undefended pieces, which are often born by letting your opponents go wrong, giving them a chance to mess up, and then capitalizing. So it's just worth thinking about. You're the higher rated player. You want your opponents to hopefully make life easy for you in a game. Give them a chance to mess up. Don't feel like you got to force things. That's why I don't tend to play tactically against lower rated players, because why should I? If I play tactically, it just comes down to a calculation contest. And I could mess up a calculation. I don't want to go down some narrow road where both my opponents and I are calculating 95% of the same lines, and oops, I made a mistake and I lose the game. I want them to beat me in an open-ended position where they're going to have to make many difficult and potentially abstract decisions in a row. Okay? So that explains this whole fianchetto operation. Again, knight c6. This is not in the top 5 moves, but it looks reasonable. I thought it was fine. Yeah, rook c8, inviting this b4 move. Bishop b2. The engine also indicating that e4 might be a decent possibility. This starts to look a little more like a Maroczy bind, where white is positioning their pieces to control the d5 square. I think I would have played d6. I commentated that in such a setup, usually the queenside knight is better off on d7 because it doesn't block the bishop. It also won't block the rook on the c file. It avoids some issues. Let's just say if we play some standard hedgehog moves like this, I think I mentioned this in game, but if you have the knight on c6, sometimes this knight d5 move is a problem, hitting the queen and taking advantage of the pin on the c file, the pin on that knight. So knight on d7 avoids a lot of that. So yeah, maybe white could have played e4 here. Wasn't really thinking about it during the game. Wasn't expecting it, but wouldn't have minded seeing that. But they played bishop b2. Yeah, and I think I had a bit of a think here. Not a really long one. Well, actually, over a minute. Yeah, a little more than a minute. Down from 8:51 to 7:47. Because it struck me as a turning point. Again, I could play this d5 move. I think that's just my default move on almost every move here. Interesting that the engine now gives a pretty appreciable advantage to white, because I do have the isolated pawn. Yeah, they can start laying siege to that. Yeah, who knows? I mean, maybe if white had played a little differently, I would have gone for this. But I just started looking at that a5 move, and I began thinking, hey, inducing b5, then playing knight b8, going for that hedgehog setup with these pawns being potentially overextended, that looks kind of interesting. I might be willing to try that. And the engine indeed says this is still close to equal, like a hint of an advantage for white, but really not much, 0.2. Yeah, would have been an interesting line. I could easily see something like this happening. Yeah, queen c7. Lots of maneuvering in store. And I think it's going to largely hinge on how weak this c-pawn is in the coming middle game. But I like the fact that I have a pretty bulletproof setup here. Everything's secure. Black has a little less space compared to white, but that's a common characteristic of the hedgehog setup, where black sits back on these last three ranks. If you like the hedgehog, by the way, I have a video on the hedgehog. If you search my channel, there's also 2 books written by Sergei Shipov that are really good. Pretty much the Bibles of the hedgehog. If you can say Bibles in a plural way. So he's done a really good job with those books. Would recommend them highly if you're interested in this opening or this setup. So yeah, after a5, I do think b5 was the critical move. If white takes on a5, I mentioned this, taking with the knight and attacking the pawn looks pretty good. Yeah, white can defend it, but I have ways to increase the pressure, or yeah, maybe go for d5 now when there's no issues with an isolated pawn or something. Engine still says this is close to equal, but probably white's on the defensive now a bit. So white had to do something about this attack. They played queen b3, and they just don't get compensation here. I think knight takes b4 or bishop takes b4 are fine. Engine has them almost neck and neck. Maybe slight preference for knight takes. I don't think that's enough to sway me one way or the other. Ooh, it doesn't like bishop takes as much because of knight d5. Interesting. Yeah, I can't say I was looking at that in this position. That's a deflection attempt, trying to cast some doubt over my coordination between the knight and the bishop. That would have been really interesting had white tried that, but wasn't to be. Looks like I can still get to a position up a pawn pretty easily. So I took with the bishop. White played knight b5. I sent this knight to the center. Looks fine. Yeah, other moves come to mind too. Bishop c5. The engine's indicating to stabilize the bishop. We're talking about pretty marginal differences in the evaluation, though. Yep, rook fd1. I think that made sense. Again, if white went here right away, looking for trades, looking for bishop f3, they run into knight d2 with the fork. And I guess even this doesn't turn out so well for white. This could get a little complicated, though. With rook fd1, do I play queen g5? Yeah, I play for checkmate to get out of the pin. I can maybe circle back here or something. Or I just have an attack towards their king. So knight e4, rook d1, queen e7. Queen e7 looked pretty sensible to me. Computer says queen d3 maybe to take advantage. I would think knight c5 here, but all right. White's apparently got something to show for the pawn. Maybe my bishop isn't as well placed here as I thought. Maybe there's some sort of logjam, but still looks like a clean pawn to me. Maybe knight d6 is a thing. Yeah, it's interesting. It hates this move by white. Knight fd4. Really dislikes that. Oh, apparently, yeah, knight a7. That was a thing at various moments. Wasn't really scared of that here, because it's not like if I take, white can take on b4, because the queen is defending, but this does give white some activity, which is rook takes. So what if I play like here? Rook a8, take, bishop takes. Okay, knight e5. Barely an edge to black despite the extra pawn. So maybe there are some circumstances where if white engineers their activity in precisely the right way and my pieces are caught a little off guard, white's still in this thing or has full compensation. But I think it's pretty specific. Yeah, pretty specific. Knight a7, queen d3. Those are maybe things in a classical game both my opponent and I would be thinking about a little closer. But in a 10+2, we're still playing pretty quickly here. Trying not to get below 5 minutes. Yeah, knight a5. I'm pleased to see that knight a5 is the best move here, because my first instinct was trade knights. I'm up a pawn, so why not trade? But these knights are kind of superfluous. That's a Mark Dvoretsky concept. These knights sort of step on each other's toes a little bit. And this knight on d4 also blocks their bishop. So pivoting here, attacking the queen, also hitting the pawn. Looks nice. Gains time. And here I played d5. It does say that I could have played this right away. Go for this. Yeah, nothing wrong with that. But a few extra things to calculate. I didn't see the reason. I didn't see a reason to take at least a calculation risk like this and have to crunch the numbers a little more, making sure that I could win my piece back. But also good to see that this is playable. Yeah, d5. Okay, so had white played knight a7 right away, how would this go? Okay, it does say rook c5 is good here. Interesting. And what if f3 at this point? Ah, now I can play knight d6, and they can't trade the knight. So I can add yet another attacker to this pawn on c4. What about this move, hitting the bishop? Rook takes c4. Uh-huh. Little exchange sacrifice. Queen defends the bishop. Okay, I don't think I would have gone for this, but it's neat to see the nuances available there, because I was wondering if rook c5 was playable in some cases where white plays knight a7. So had white played knight a7 right away, I don't know what I would have done. I might have played this, but I would have at all times had to account for this queen a4 move, the various permutations of it. Yeah, because if white plays queen a4 here, I mentioned this in the game, I thought bishop c3 would be a good reply. And the presence of my knight remaining on e4 makes a big difference compared to the game continuation. Because in the game, white threw in f3. I was debating whether to go here or here. Computer says either of those are fine. Also says I can take here right away, which I don't think I even looked at. That works because of what? Knight takes e3. Okay, so this is evidently also good. I don't like this from a human standpoint because I don't see a reason to unbalance the game when I'm already ahead a pawn and potentially two pawns. I'd have to, correctly assess whether the what is the imbalance here? Rook plus 4 pawns. Is it 4 pawns I have extra? Rook plus 4 pawns is better than the 2 minor pieces. That's right. White has 4 minor pieces to my 2. I have an extra rook and 4 pawns. So that's just a very weird imbalance. So I don't think I would have gone for that in a game. I didn't go for that in a game. I just pulled my knight back to f6. Yeah, and now here, and I do think the difference now is on rook c5, This is still worse for white, but queen a4 looks more testing because I don't have this bishop c3 response anymore without my knight on e4. My bishop's attacked. Looks like I got to retreat here to keep my advantage. So I instead played rook a8. Looks much simpler. Yeah, and now white can't take because, again, another difference. When you're calculating, you do a lot of this, comparing lines that maybe have some calculations that are applied on one move, but then if one piece moves just off of one square, everything changes. But also you're still taking into account a lot of similar lines, right? You do that constantly in chess. So now taking makes no sense for white because I think I can just take here. Not even the best move according to the engine, but close. But main point is, without a knight on e4, white doesn't have queen takes e4 as a threat here. So rook a8 hit the knight. And I do wonder about knight db5 at this point. Trying to rescue this knight and also open the bishop. I mean, maybe I could just even do... Oh, no, I can't do this because the knight covers. Yeah, lots of playable moves here, apparently. I don't know what I would have played against this. I might have been tempted to try to take advantage of the two knights like this, which is fine, but by no means the only way to play. I mean, I also might have done something stabilizing or just trade down a little bit. I think at some point these knights are probably going to be exposed as awkward, is my instinct. Okay, so the knight went back, and this felt so harmonious. Get the other rook in the game. The one piece that isn't really participating yet. I've got both rooks deployed on the queen side. This rook is covering the a7 square. Now I'm ready to take on c4. Yeah, it doesn't look like white has much here because the bishop's also guarded. White's losing another pawn by virtue of this pin. Yeah, lots of good moves here too. D takes c4 is good. Bishop a6 is good. This looks nice and straightforward. Had they taken with the rook, I probably would have taken with the bishop just to leave this. Apparently this is fine as well. Yeah, some line like this. But many ways to get the job done here. Same thing here. Could have taken on c4 right away, but I like throwing this in. Now I'm up the 2 pawns. White tried to block my pieces, but ran into queen c5. If white hadn't blundered here, I would have focused further on consolidating and coordinating. So maybe knight d5 if I get a chance. Maybe queen c5 anyways in some cases. I'd have to perhaps mine knight d6, which is not possible here because of bishop takes. Maybe c3 if I could make it work tactically. In the long run, I do want to push those connected pawns, but as I said during the game, I'm not in a rush to do so. You can take your time and consolidate, shut down enemy counterplay, and then look to advance later with this level of a stable advantage. Yeah, check. If knight d4, e5 wins a piece just the same. Yeah, and this was, I think, all discussed in the game. Nothing really extra to add here. All right, so pretty one-sided, but hopefully you guys can see, even in a game like this, where clearly a lot of it was determined by white losing a pawn early on, and then apparently playing a big mistake with knight d4, which I wouldn't have necessarily predicted was a bigger mistake than letting the pawn go, but the engine indicates that. Even in a case like this, there's plenty of stuff we can suss out and talk about to get better at chess. So I highly encourage you to analyze even the games that you won in seemingly straightforward fashion, because you're going to find plenty of stuff that you could have improved upon, and that might be fodder for an internal discussion. And also things your opponent could have improved upon, certainly. So if you ever get a chance to analyze with a stronger player or work with a coach, you will notice that a good coach is not going to dismiss the games that you won, even though ones that were short or seemingly one-sided. They're still going to try to suss out lessons from everything. All right. Well, good to be back to the standard series. I'm pumped to record more of these this year, so stay tuned for that. Let me know if you guys have any questions on this one. and I'll see you guys again soon. Thanks for watching, especially the analysis crew for sticking around. All right, bye, guys.